On Tuesday and Wednesday, NATO and its allies met in Vilnius, Lithuania, for the alliance's 74th annual summit. The main thing on the agenda was, unsurprisingly, Ukraine, and more specifically, whether NATO would provide a concrete path to membership for Ukraine. Despite an upbeat start to the summit, after Turkey suddenly approved Sweden's accession, the mood soured on Tuesday afternoon, when NATO's joint communique essentially implied that Ukraine wouldn't be joining NATO anytime soon, and that there was nothing they could do about it. So in this video, we're going to take a look at NATO's statement, why Ukraine is angry, and what might happen next. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start with a bit of context. Basically, while no NATO member really wants to bring Ukraine into the bloc while it's fighting a war with Russia, because that would require NATO to fight Russia and probably end up with World War III, some NATO members, including France, Poland, and the Baltic countries, argued before the summit that NATO should provide Ukraine with a series of concrete steps and criteria it could reach, which would then imply membership. These might be, for example, reaching a peace agreement with Russia or weeding out corruption in the armed forces. And if Ukraine were to do these things, then it would automatically become a member of NATO. These NATO members argued that the promise of automatic membership was only fair to Ukraine, given how much Ukraine was doing to defend the European continent, and that it would deter Putin from continuing his invasion. Other NATO members, however, most notably Germany and the US, were wary that the prospect of automatic accession might actually provoke Putin into a retaliation, and instead wanted NATO just to say that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance sometime in the future, without providing any concrete criteria for accession. The idea is that this gives NATO more flexibility in the future, and at least from America's perspective, allows them to focus more on China and the Indo-Pacific. These members also argue that NATO can defend Ukraine without bringing it into NATO, as they've done throughout the war via military aid and via bi- and multilateral security guarantees, even if this falls short of NATO's Article 5. Anyway, going into the summit, there was still a sense of optimism among some NATO members, not least because on Monday evening, Erdogan suddenly U-turned and said that he'd let Sweden into the bloc. But as I said in the intro, the mood soured significantly on Tuesday afternoon when NATO published its joint communique. And judging by what's said in the communique, it looks like Germany and the US prevailed in this argument, because it provides no concrete path to membership, and there's no mention of any criteria for Ukraine's accession. The language used is actually pretty woolly, because while NATO reiterated that Ukraine's future is in NATO, and that Ukraine won't need a full membership action plan to join, the 11th clause only states that NATO, quote, will be in a position to extend an invitation to Ukraine to join the alliance when allies agree and conditions are met, which basically leaves Ukraine's NATO accession up in the air. In a way, this shouldn't have come as much of a surprise, both because what America says usually goes in NATO, and because of the fact that NATO operates by a principle of unanimity, i.e., every member has to agree on everything, which also means that every member has a veto, meaning that its statements usually lean towards being conservative. Nonetheless, this didn't go down well with Zelenskyy, and understandably so. In a tweet on Tuesday, he described the statement as absurd, and claimed that NATO had promised to use a different wording before going back on their word. Then on Wednesday, he said that while he still had faith, he no longer had confidence in NATO. So, is Zelensky's reaction fair? In other words, is this statement actually a mistake? Well, obviously there's no simple answer to this, The US and Germany, for example, would argue that the dovish language actually reduces the risk of an escalation by Putin, and that the recognition that Ukraine won't need a membership action plan to join NATO, which should make accession significantly easier when it does happen, and as well as the creation of a new NATO-Ukraine Council, represents significant progress in NATO-Ukraine relations. They'll also point to the fact that NATO and individual NATO members are still doing their bit by sending copious amounts of military aid to Ukraine. And the US has reportedly explicitly argued for an Israel-style relationship with Ukraine. In practice, this would involve keeping Ukraine outside of NATO, but creating a bilateral alliance with it and providing the country with enough military aid to deter Russia from ever invading again. France and the Baltics, however, would argue that this week's statements do risk making the same mistakes as 2008. For context, at NATO's 2008 summit in Bucharest, there was a disagreement over whether or not to provide Ukraine with a membership action plan. At the time, the US wanted to give Ukraine and Georgia membership action plans, but France and Germany were worried about provoking Russia. In the end, the bloc decided on a sort of fudge. They didn't provide Ukraine or Georgia with a membership action plan, but stated that Ukraine will join NATO. In retrospect, this was kind of the worst of both worlds. The statement was strong enough to provoke a reaction from Putin, who's been railing against NATO expansion ever since, but also not strong enough to deter him from invading.
Apologies to quote you at yourself, but some of my colleagues are a big fan. So I thought I'd reference an appearance you had on the Talking Politics podcast last year, during which you described the Bucharest Declaration when NATO said that Ukraine will become a member of NATO without promising a membership action plan as a botched compromise. How do you think NATO can better guarantee Ukraine's security this week?
On the subject of Ukraine and NATO membership, the Bucharest Declaration in 2008 made the mistake of saying that Ukraine would join the alliance, it will become a member, but it didn't say how and it didn't say when. And the vital thing that has to come out of the Vilnius summit is a credible signal that there is a pathway for Ukraine when the war is over, that there is a tangible roadmap that gives them a sense of this not being something in the dim and distant future that might or might not happen, but that there are steps they can take that will see them in the alliance in a reasonable period of time. And in the absence of that, I think we have to remember we're going to have to prop up Ukraine's armed forces with huge amounts of support, huge amounts of cash. That's going to be much more expensive, much more burdensome than giving them a credible path into the alliance.
Anyway, France and the Baltics will argue today that, like in 2008, the language being used in this summit is enough to annoy Russia, but not enough to deter Putin from continuing his invasion. They might also argue that an Israel-style relationship with Ukraine is far more expensive than just NATO membership. That's because NATO membership is, in a sense, cheap, because individual member states know that they don't have to spend that much money on defense as long as the whole bloc spends enough money to maintain its deterrent. An Israel-style relationship, on the other hand, would be super expensive. The US currently spends billions of dollars sending arms to Israel. And while America might be able to afford this, other NATO members in Europe are already pushing their military budgets as high as they can and worrying about their depleted stockpiles. And this issue was particularly apparent in comments made by the UK Defence Minister Ben Wallace, who warned that NATO members were already going into their reserve stockpiles to send weapons to Ukraine, and suggested that Ukraine should show NATO more gratitude. Ultimately, though, whether history judges this summit to be a success or a failure will depend on what happens next. If Russia escalates or gains some sort of advantage in the war, it will look like a failure, and France and the Baltics will get to say, "I told you so." Alternatively, if Ukraine makes further gains and eventually forces Russia to concede territory in peace negotiations, America and Germany will be able to paint their patience as prescience. Regardless, if you want to learn more about what happened at the summit, you can check out our series of interviews that we actually conducted at the NATO summit. We've made a playlist which will have all of the videos added to it as they come out, and it's linked in the description. So be sure to check it out. If you want more updates on this story and others, then be sure to check out our show, The Daily Briefing. Now, we obviously discuss a whole load of news across the TLDR network, but the daily briefing is your quick update, getting you up to speed on the world's biggest political issues in just a matter of minutes. Now, a bunch of other news organizations obviously do these kinds of daily summaries, but coming from TLDR, you know that it has our normal, unbiased, explanatory, and only semi-serious tone. So if you want to feel fully tuned in, check out the daily briefing. You can watch on YouTube or Nebula just by searching for the TLDR Daily Briefing, or you can listen by searching for us in your favorite podcast app. Thanks for your support.